Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex. I am Vizcaya's social media person, and I'm here with Ian Simpkins, our Deputy Director of Horticulture, for this week's Ask Me Anything, Garden Edition again. So I'll let Ian introduce himself.
Good morning, I'm Ian Simpkins. I am the Deputy Director of Horticulture for Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, and I am here to happily answer your garden questions today. And like many of us, I am partially working from home, so you actually get to see a little bit of my garden behind me.
A little behind the scenes.
Yes.
So we have been collecting questions from you guys over the past week or so and have about 20 questions that we can pick from. But if you have not submitted your question already, you're welcome to do so in the comments, and we will answer a little bit of pre-submitted questions and live questions. So the first question comes from Rosa Castro on Facebook, and she asks, other than orchids, what other flowering plants did Deering have originally?
Hi, Rosa. That's a great question. And Deering actually was a great fan of flowers. He really liked things to be pretty, as he called it. And we have a fair amount of information in the archival records about what kind of flowers Mr. Deering liked. And he actually wanted gardens devoted to specific types of flowers. The designer of the gardens at that time, when they were focusing on those little details, Paul Chalfin, did not want gardens devoted to specific types of flowers, and so they reached a compromise in certain areas. But Mr. Deering specifically mentioned gardenias. He was a great fan of gardenias. He also mentioned hibiscus, and several conversations were held about orchids. Mr. Deering wanted a garden devoted to orchids, and he and Chalfin both agreed that having orchids in the trees throughout the property would be something really interesting and something really beautiful. And in certain areas of the gardens, Chalfin relented and allowed flowers to be planted, and the lower east terrace is one of those areas, and it was planted with flowers pretty extensively, and we still do that today.
Okay, perfect. One of our donors, actually, Ariel Penzer, who follows us on Instagram, asked, how do you, or what are some plants that attract butterflies to the garden?
Well, thank you, Ariel, for your contribution. At this time in Vizcaya's history, we need those contributions more than ever. So I'm very grateful for you doing that and your generosity. There are actually quite a few flowers that attract butterflies. Some are native, some are not. The old favorites for attracting butterflies are pentas and lantana. Pentas is a nice flower that you can find pretty readily, and it blooms more or less year round. Lantana, you have to be careful because they can be invasive, and some of the newer hybrids address that. There is a native lantana called Pineland lantana, Lantana depressa, that is not invasive and is a butterfly magnet, just like the hybrids are. And there are many different native plants that you can use to attract butterflies into your yard. Some of the native passion flowers, like corky stem passion flower, is a huge butterfly attractor. And Simpson stopper, one of my favorite plants, is a butterfly attractor as well. There are other plants that you can use to attract butterflies in the gardens, and those vary. It's a wide variety of plants. And I have a few plants here that are huge butterfly attractors. One is called Buddha belly, excuse me, Jatropha podagrica, and that one actually is a huge attractor for orange julias and zebra longwings. And generally, when you look for butterfly attracting plants, you want plants that flower with bright colors. Generally, the flowers should be a little bit smaller so the butterflies can get their nectar sucking proboscis in there. If you look up subtropical or tropical butterfly attracting plants on Google, you're going to find a wealth of information. And let's not forget the monarch butterflies. We have a year-round population here, and as such, it's important to keep them happy and fed. And really, the milkweeds are the best for that. They're specially adapted for feeding on the poisonous milkweed plants. And the best milkweeds to use would be the native milkweeds, Asclepias tuberosa. There also is a tropical milkweed that you can use, Asclepias incarnata, which is a monarch attractor as well. And I have those here in my garden. But as always, it's best to use the native plants because they're specifically adapted to the pollinators that are in your area. And let's not forget salvias. Salvias are a huge butterfly attractor as well, and we have quite a bit in the gardens in the Lower East Terrace as well.
Very thorough answer, as always. Thank you for that. So our next question comes from Tiza on Instagram, and she needs help getting rid of tiny yellow insects on her desert rose plant. She says that there's millions of them, and this is a recurring problem.
In order to give you specific advice, I'd have to see them. I suspect if there are tons of them and they're tiny and yellow, they're probably aphids. If they are indeed aphids, probably the safest method that you can use to get rid of them is just direct a strong stream of water at the plants and wash them off with that stream of water. Once they're off the plant, then they'll die and you may not have that problem anymore. You can use an insecticidal soap to remove them as well, but you need to apply that in the morning when it's cool, when the sun is not on the plant. But your best bet would be to just wash the plant off. Just take your hose and just wash it off and keep washing it off until all the bugs are gone. And then you shouldn't have any more problems with it. But if you do, just take the hose to it again and wash it off. And then that way you are not using any pesticides that can affect other insects.
Great. Okay, for our next question, I'm going to have to put it on the screen because I am going to mispronounce this. So this question comes from Emily Rosenthal from Facebook. She's one of our top followers, and I believe she worked at Vizcaya at one point as well.
Yeah. Emily and I know each other well. Hello, Emily.
Awesome. So she asks, help me pronounce this about this type of tree.
Frangipani.
Thank you. And apparently when it exfoliates, it looks like a pile of sticks, and she needs some help with her plant.
Yeah, Frangipani go through a dormancy. Some of the woody members of the dogbane family will do that, and that's completely normal. They usually will go into dormancy during the winter. Once the day length lessens and we get past the fall equinox, generally that's when you start to see the leaves drop. And that is completely normal. There's nothing really that you can do about it, and there's nothing you can do to coax it back into leaf. You may get a few leaves coming out here and there, but for the most part, it's going to be dormant. There are a few exceptions. Some of the Caribbean native, there's a couple species of native Frangipani to the Caribbean, and those tend to have a mixed dormancy, or like this guy here behind me, Plumeria alba, which is a Caribbean native. That one stays evergreen year round, but a lot of the hybrids will drop their leaves, and really there's nothing for you to do. Just water it a few times during the winter to keep the soil from drying out completely. But that's really about it. Once you start to see the leaves coming out in the spring, that's when you should fertilize it and start increasing the water.
Okay, great. Martica de Torres here live with us on Facebook has a couple of questions. I'll put one of them on the screen. So she lives here in the Grove and she's wondering if she can plant Arika palms and bougainvilleas in her backyard, if they'll be okay in the heat.
Yeah, they'll be fine. They'll be fine. No problem at all. They both can take the heat. Bougainvillea especially does really well in the heat, and it does really well in, sorry, my glasses are crooked. It does really well in hot, dry situations, which is why you see it grown all over the Mediterranean. The Arika palm will do fine in the heat. The one thing that I would recommend you do is if you plant them, make sure that you keep them well watered for at least 6 months until they're established. It's going to take at least that long for them to start to root into the soil and begin to drop water on their own. And until that point, you need to make sure you keep them watered. Otherwise, they're going to dry out and you'll run into problems. The rain that we're getting is usually not enough unless we get heavy rains all the time. And this summer has been really dry. So, this summer more than ever, it's important to make sure you keep the water to them.
Got it. We'll do another live question here from Charlotte Dawn, who happens to be our director of marketing and a faithful live stream follower. So she wants to know more about the things that were planted in the village.
Hi, Charlotte. Well, there was a lot of things planted in the village. We actually have a record of some things that were planted in the village, and they planted anything from cut flower crops like cannas and periwinkle and things like that, to edible crops like corn and potatoes and so on. And they also received plants from Dr. David Fairchild, such as banyan trees and some other fruit trees. And we have records of avocado, several different types of avocado, mango, citrus, and other fruiting trees and plants that were planted in the village. It really was quite a wide variety, and we have records of some of that.
Perfect. We always get questions about orchids. I guess everybody knows Vizcaya for orchids, and I'm going to put this on the screen because it'll lead us into talking about that next. But the question is just, how do you make orchids bloom?
Fertilizer. Fertilize. I can speak to this firsthand. I have a small collection of orchids myself, both on the trees and mounted and in pots. And I had always been a decent orchid grower until I began to fertilize them regularly. And so I water my orchids 2 to 3 times per week, regardless of whether it rains or not. If we end up in a really wet period, then I won't water them because I don't want them to get too wet and you run into problems. But your best bet to getting orchids to flower is regular water and fertilizer. There is a orchid fertilizer that you can buy at Home Depot. It comes in a pink bag. I don't remember the name. But regardless of what brand you use, you want to make sure that the fertilizer is urea free. A lot of commercially available fertilizers use urea for the nitrogen source, and that's too hot for your orchids, and it can burn them. You can go to a orchid grower such as RF Orchids, or what's the other one that I am thinking of? Well, I'm drawing a blank, but they're located in Ophi Greenhouse Supply. They specialize in orchids, especially cattleyas, and they have a good supply of orchid fertilizer that you can use. For me personally, I use a little bit of Super Thrive, just a tiny bit. I use a tiny bit of kelp fertilizer, and then I use a commercially available orchid fertilizer that I got from Home Depot. There is a fertilizer that I've used in the past called Bloombastic. It is expensive, but you only need a tiny little bit of it. and it drives the orchids crazy. They just love it. It's made for hydroponic growing, but I found that it does very, very well with orchids because it's very mild, but it packs a punch. So water and fertilizer is your best bet.
Perfect. And I didn't say who asked that question. So that was from Kalua. She asked that on Facebook during our last live stream.
Great.
Yep. So talking about the greenhouse experience, for all of you who are probably with us and are big garden and flower orchid fans, we have a greenhouse experience where we take you behind the scenes into our orchid greenhouse with horticulture staff. It's a very cool kind of exclusive thing that you get to do. And it's socially distanced for 9 people only. Our next one is today at 10 and probably already sold out. But if you go to this link, vizcaya.org/greenhouse, you can sign up for our email list to be notified of the next date. And obviously, the higher the demand that we have for this experience, the more likely we are to offer it again. But I think that is it for today in terms of our AMA. If there are any additional questions that you guys would like to ask, please feel free to leave them in the comments. We have a running list here, and we will address it next Friday as well.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone, for your questions.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.